The races you aren't hearing about this election year could have the biggest impact on your life. Plus, more questions than answers, a criminal investigation, and official censures, all from a single audio recording. And with COVID back on the rise, your child's school may be forced to close its doors yet again. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.
Welcome to Kansas Week. I'm your host, Pilar Pedraza. COVID numbers across the state have been rising for a few weeks now, and they're now reaching the point that local schools are looking at making some changes. Let's take a quick look at the numbers first. Statewide, the percent of those tested who are positive for COVID topped 15% again this week. Here in Sedgwick County, the recent positive rate is now nearly 26%. Yet, at the same time, many schools are doing away with one precaution, taking your child's temperature when they get to the schoolhouse door. Cakes Bree Smith takes a look at why.
You can get up, come on. I just feel like it's up to the parents and not the school. I don't feel like that's their responsibility to do.
Elementary age kids come and go from school every day during the pandemic, just like they always have. And parents say the responsibility of knowing if your kid is running a fever or not shouldn't change either.
Even if she had the stomach flu or anything, like I'm not going to send her to school, whether it's COVID or the flu or just like a 24-hour bug, like she would need to stay home.
And if I know she has a runny nose or a fever, I'm not going to send her to school either way.
Earlier this week, the Wichita School District stopped taking students' temperatures at the door. Administrators tell us evidence from the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics shows this kind of screening is unnecessary and unreliable.
I think we're good without it. Like I said, if you know your kid has a temperature, you'll know if they're sick or if they're hot.
Parents say teachers already do so much in the classroom to keep kids safe.
I feel like there's teachers, they're so spread thin right now with some doing remote, some here, and then just having to, keep masks on little kids that are 4 and 5 years old.
A local teacher who wants to remain anonymous told us this about discontinuing temperature checks. Quote, if we're not ready to be 100% interested in student and staff health, then kids shouldn't be back in the building 5 days a week. But parents we talk to say their kids are well taken care of.
My daughter says they do a really good job keeping their masks on and keeping to themselves and washing their hands. So I think the kids have a pretty good understanding of what's going on, and they try to keep themselves safe as well.
Certainly enough there to keep us talking today. Joining the discussion by Zoom, we have Dr. Michael Smith, a political scientist from Emporia State University. And here on set with me is Suzanne Perez with the Wichita Eagle. Thank you both so much for being here. And Suzanne, I'm going to start with you. You have all of this experience covering schools for so many years. But this is something outside of the experience of anybody. Even as we're recording this show, the Wichita Public Schools going into a special school board meeting to discuss what they need to do because of those new positivity rates.
Right. The numbers are really skyrocketing. They've gone up incredibly, and the deaths have gone up incredibly in the state just over the last few months. So that is obviously a concern. But Wichita school board members, this is the largest school district in the state, some of the largest school buildings in the state. They have kept secondary schools closed. Now they want to reopen them on November 9th. At least they voted that last week. With numbers going up, they're going to possibly reconsider that. But the fact is, with these temperature checks, so you have some elementary kids going to school. That is one, outward sign that they're, just kind of checking and making sure everybody at least doesn't have a temperature. But yeah, you got to wonder, how effective that is when you can really spread the coronavirus and be asymptomatic and not have a temperature at all. So is this just one more thing that we're putting on the teachers? That said, parents, frankly, have sent sick kids to school for a long time.
Yep.
I mean, and not by choice, not on purpose maybe, but it just happens, and we have to be so careful about that now, that I can understand that teachers especially would want those temperature checks taken.
Yeah. Well, and you talked about parents have sent their sick kids to school for a long time, either knowingly or unknowingly. A lot of districts are relying on parents to sign off that they've checked their child's temperature every morning.
Right. I mean, and yes, I mean, I suppose they can say, you can say, yeah, we did. It's just, I don't know, this is just such a strange time, and parents are under so much pressure too. I mean, a lot of parents, not all of them obviously, but are really pushing school officials to reopen schools because, they need to work. They are having a hard time balancing, teaching their children at home, supervising their children, and getting work done. So I mean, you can really see the push and pull on both sides of that issue for sure.
Certainly very confusing, lots of different factors going into that. And Michael, a lot of that perhaps why we're seeing so many different decisions being made across the state and how to deal with this pandemic.
Well, part of it is because of the way the state has handled it. As you know, initially Governor Kelly wanted and passed statewide mandates, but she got a lot of pushback, including some checks on her powers. So now it's more on a county by county basis. And the Board of Education also pushed back, so the school districts have some autonomy. So we have a lot of differences among school districts, and it's kind of frustrating because, of course, the virus doesn't care what school district or what county it's in.
Yeah, and another aspect of that, you brought up the fact that the governor originally wanted a statewide mandate. Again, this week, talking about that, had a meeting with Republican leadership and walked out, instead of saying we're going to have a statewide mandate or even a special session, which she at one point had said might happen, came out with kind of this compromise plan of we're all going to kind of push masks together. Effective or too little too late at this point?
Well, it's obviously too little too late to stop what's already happened. There's tremendous political pushback, particularly in rural communities, but there's some in urban ones too. There's some resistance in Johnson County, as well as, of course, down there in Sedgwick, but a lot of resistance in rural areas. And really, my thinking lately has been that a lot of this is really cultural, that it's not just about a mandate or what the governor does or what the county does. It's culture, and metropolitan rural cultures are different, and they're responding to things like the expectations we wear masks differently because the cultures are different.
An interesting point there. Well, along with more people testing positive for COVID, more are ending up in the hospital now. And that's not good news for a lot of people. This week, Ascension Via Christi and Wesley hospitals announced they had hit a record for the number of COVID patients in their beds. Via Christi even talking about the possibility of opening a tent ward for overflow patients if the current trends continue. Meanwhile, hospitals in western Kansas were down to just 9% of ICU beds available for COVID patients at one point this week, as KSN's Keisha Batman shows us.
Kearney County Hospital is among many rural hospitals that does not have an ICU. When patients need further care, they are transferred to their nearest critical care unit. But sometimes that's not an option.
We've found that the ICU beds are very hard to come by.
Dr. Miller said he was recently treating a COVID-19 patient whose health was deteriorating.
We are doing our best to take care of COVID patients in our local hospital as best as we can.
The small hospital had reached its resource and respiratory capabilities. His patient needed to be transferred for further care, but he says that day no ICU beds were available.
The regional hospitals that we would transfer to are full.
Miller says his patient had to wait and hope a bed would open up. And the next day, one did. For Dr. Miller, he says the feeling of not being able to give a patient the level of care they need when they need it was uncomfortable.
It was an uncomfortable and difficult time to not have the opportunity to transfer a patient.
KSN reached out to the three major hospitals in the southwest part of the state. Southwest Medical Center and Liberal says their bed availability has been strained. St. Catherine's Hospital in Garden City says they're seeing an increase in patients requiring a higher level of care. Officials point out some patients with medical issues not related to COVID are delaying care, putting them in a more serious situation when they are treated. The third major hospital, Western Plains Medical Complex in Dodge City, did not want to comment. Here for you in Kearney County, Keisha Batman, KSN News 3.
And to a certain extent, Suzanne, this is what hospitals were warning us about back in March and April when they were trying to get that shut down and that whole phrase flatten the curve. Right.
It was all about capacity, ICU capacity, number of ventilators, things like that. And I mean, these are really scary numbers. You know, when Tom Stoles, the Sedgwick County manager, just piped up during the county commission meeting this week saying, hey, we just heard from our hospital system that it's basically kind of a red alert time right now, and they're concerned. They want to talk about emergency funding. They want to talk about, you know, overflow situations. You know, we post that on social media, and I've heard from some people who say, well, you know, a lot of those patients are from outside the city. You know, it doesn't say anything about our numbers. You know, those hospitalizations aren't reflective of our local numbers, but they certainly are reflective of our state and regional numbers, and those patients have to go somewhere. So when these, you know, rural hospitals start, you know, hitting capacity, they're going to come here, and there's just all of the repercussions that happen after that.
Yeah, and certainly as we are looking at that, you know, we're at the beginning of the winter cold and flu season here, Michael. And we talked a little bit earlier about it being a case of culture and how we react. We're seeing the numbers go up even in rural county areas, though. Does that start to at some point impact the culture and the ways that people react to something like this?
It may. I mean, typically what really can change someone's mind is when someone they know personally have been affected or when they have. And so there's a big difference between hearing about it on the news and having a family member, caring for a family member, a friend, maybe even yourself. It can really change minds. That said, in the rural areas, it is still hitting hot spots like assisted care facilities. And so there are still probably quite a few people that see this as an issue they hear about on the news as opposed to that touches their own family. And with people not always trusting the news, that could still be a barrier.
Interesting. And finding that balance, it kind of brings us back then to the governor's efforts to get more of a statewide response. You talked about it touching on them individually. Is that where perhaps local lawmakers, state lawmakers, and their phraseology and what they support maybe comes into play?
I think it is. You know, we call the states laboratories of democracy in this country. We pride on ourselves on the local government's right to kind of do their own thing within certain parameters. This is an issue where leadership is as much about persuading as it is about mandating. And unfortunately, the whole debate has been about, are you going to mandate this? Are you going to require this? Are you going to mandate this? And any talk of mandates gets such heavy pushback in rural communities and some in urban ones too. What we haven't seen is the leadership in terms of role modeling, always wearing a mask, scheduling their own rallies in such a way that they're practicing social distancing. And I think the role modeling is, if anything, as important or more important than the mandates. And that includes those rural communities, absolutely.
Fascinating perspective there, Michael. Thank you. We're going to turn our attention now from COVID to a political scandal here in Sedgwick County that's been dominating the local headlines. We first told you last week here on Kansas Week about the audio recordings involving 3 local politicians. Now, questions abound about what Kansans can do to get the men involved out of office. I looked at the options in this story I filed with Cake News.
I want to get it addressed. Like I said, there's a lot of things that need to be done.
Pointing to the county budget and the ongoing pandemic, county commissioners I spoke with Monday call the scandal involving fellow Commissioner Michael O'Donnell a distraction they want to move past.
And you just keep saying, unfortunately, this is a pattern of behavior where Dalton will attack the Republicans and support the Democrats, like Justice Shepard.
They're referring to this audio recording released Friday in which you can hear 3 men apparently plotting to blame others for a false attack ad in last year's mayoral race. The attorney who released the recording says the men in it are Wichita City Councilman James Clendenin, State Representative Michael Capps, and Sedgwick County Commissioner Michael O'Donnell. Calls for their resignations have come from all corners of the state and from those they work with.
they don't have the trust of the people to serve as elected officials at this point.
According to the Sedgwick County District Attorney, there are only two methods of getting the men out of office if they don't resign: a recall petition and an ouster. A recall petition would only apply to Clendenin because the other two men are too close to the end of their current terms in office, which leaves something called an ouster. This is where the county can basically force them from office for things like not doing their job, breaking laws, or something called moral turpitude, a moral failing of some sort.
Clearly, I'm disappointed to hear the details of that audio recording. I think it speaks for itself. We do stand for ethical behavior.
The DA's office says it began an ouster investigation with the Wichita Police and Sedgwick County Sheriff's Office the day the audio recording came out. It applies to all three politicians. Michael Capps and Michael O'Donnell have not said anything about the recording since it came out, but James Clendenin just released this statement saying he did not know about the ad until after it was produced, has never lied to blame anyone else for it, and regrets attending the meeting in the recording.
Now, since that story aired, Michael O'Donnell has also said he does not know anything about how the ad was produced, but he found about it later. Now, both the Wichita City Council and the Sedgwick County Commission have officially censured the men involved. That's about all they can do at this point. Meanwhile, many voters have been asking me if they can go back and change votes if they've already turned in their mail-in ballots. And Michael, I'm going to start with you. That's a pretty obvious no in Kansas.
That's a pretty obvious no. You're absolutely right. This is such an issue. I mean, it's not brand new either. We've had early voting for most of the 21st century, but more people are using it now. And so many people voted several weeks ago that what we used to call an October surprise doesn't have as much of an impact, because no, you can't take back your ballot and redo it except under extraordinary circumstances.
And that kind of brings us to this ouster that the Sedgwick County District Attorney is looking into, something a lot of Americans, a lot of Kansans really didn't even know existed as a possibility here. Lots of different ways it could perhaps be applied.
That's right. And I'm not an expert in local law down there in Wichita, but I do enjoy these archaic phrases like moral turpitude. That's part of why studying politics is fun. It's a complicated situation. It sounds like there's only one individual for whom it would really make sense to pursue any action. The others, you can just kind of wait them out. But I imagine that those who are talking about this are also trying to make a point. Now, it could be a point that about one's political opposition, but it could also be just a matter of principle. Hey, knock it off.
And Suzanne, the Wichita Eagle, in opinion pieces, has called for these men to resign as well.
Yeah, it's such an extraordinary situation on a number of levels. One being that the Eagles news team has been reporting on this for more than a year. So we have had a lot of what you heard in that tape. We have documented through documents and had in our news pages. But until people hear it themselves, with their own ears, and they hear, elected officials saying things like, well, what I've always learned about politics is you just lie and go on the attack, or you avoid the truth and attack. I mean, those things, it's unsettling to hear that audio, and that's what we heard from other city council members this week. It's just, but this idea that, now I want to change my vote. I mean, that's just extraordinary to me. But it'll be really, really interesting because all of these people, including, the Eagle editorial board, calling for their resignations. And so far, that's been a big no from them too. Michael O'Donnell, the county commissioner, said the people of his district deserve better, and he will be better. We'll see if he's elected again. He could be elected again on Tuesday, so we'll see what happens after that.
Yeah, and one last point on that, because he could end up winning re-election despite the political or the public will turn against him at this point. But then 120 days after that, he would be eligible for recall.
Right. So stay tuned, I guess.
This is the scandal that just keeps on rolling.
It just keeps going. Well, that's what's interesting is in the tape, one of the many extraordinary things in that tape is they say, this will all be over on Tuesday. That was the last the last election, and here we are a year later still talking about it. So the statute of limitations for scandal is pretty long.
Yeah, I think we're kind of stretching the length of it here in Wichita right now.
I think so.
All right. Well, as many of you have become aware this year, it's the local elected positions that have the most direct and immediate impact on our daily lives, which is why the state house races you're not hearing about could be among the most important, as Alec Gartner with the KSN Capitol Bureau explains.
Republicans currently hold a supermajority, or 2/3 of all the seats in the state legislature, but Democrats only need to gain 4 of the 165 total spots to change that.
Truly work on forging some compromises and some good legislation.
But many Republicans say it serves as a check on the governor.
If she vetoes something like food sales tax, we want to be able to override that because we want to have people to pay less for their groceries.
Overland Park Representative Chris Croft, a Republican, says there are many issues that need to be addressed next year, like the Department of Labor problems and property taxes. But to accomplish anything, he says lawmakers have to work together because of the lack of dollars coming in.
While we're talking about reduced budgets and reduced revenue, at the same time, we've identified all these massive issues that we're going to have to address and figure out a long-term solution to getting after them.
Wichita Representative Elizabeth Bishop, a Democrat, says a big concern of hers is improving mental health services. She says when the legislature does get to work, it's clear what the focus will be.
I believe it comes down to the coronavirus and the economy and how we structure solutions that handle both of those. And it is not going to be easy. It's not easy at the national level, and it's not going to be easy at the state level.
Both Bishop and Croft are running unopposed, as well as dozens of others. But more than 100 seats are being contested as we head to Tuesday. Reporting at the Capitol, I'm Alec Gartner.
So, Michael, what are the chances after so many years that this supermajority finally gives in?
It could end the supermajority, that's right. So let's back up. This August, we had the primaries, and in a number of Republican primaries, conservatives defeated moderates. Many of those moderates had been elected in 2016 in a push to restore school funding and undo some of the roundback tax cuts. And so it's sort of a cycling back and forth, moderates in, moderates out. So the thinking is if these districts would elect moderates, they might be open to electing Democrats as well. The Kansas Democratic Party is at a relatively good time in their history because they've got a Democratic governor right now and one U.S. House member in another part of the state. So they're charged up and they're running professional candidates. And so if they pick up some of those seats where the conservative beat the moderate in the primary, there's not going to be a Democratic majority in the state house. But yeah, they could end the supermajority.
And that certainly would change politics in Kansas as we know it.
You know, the supermajority, you know, the example there in that segment was, you know, what if the governor vetoes, you know, taxes on food and we want to do it? Well, the governor wanted to have a mask mandate, and because of the Republican supermajority, that was what sort of enabled that to go sort of to a local level. So that supermajority holds a lot of sway, and obviously the majority does too, but when you have that, when you can override a veto, that is a serious check on the governor's power, and it's exactly what we're talking about at the national level. It's just reflective of the state.
Yeah, and just a quick note, that supermajority is not as monolithic as it sounds, because while Republicans hold a supermajority, they're actually split into about two or three different factions in the state house.
Right, there's a big spectrum of Republicans,
yeah.
Sure. And Democrats,
and they're all represented.
Yes.
All right. Well, we have one more story tonight. The Kansas Secretary of State this week predicted record voter turnout, at least topping the 71% we saw in 2018, quite possibly closer to 75% this year. Much of that will ride on the massive mail-in balloting and early in-person voting we've already seen. But the drop-off boxes that have allowed so many voters to skip the post office this year are raising new questions about electioneering and voter intimidation laws here in Kansas. Last Sunday, dozens of Kansans who support President Donald Trump held a Back the Blue rally outside the Sedgwick County Election Office. It was closed at the time, but some voters were coming to the drop box across the street to cast their ballots. One family emailed Cake News saying there were around 50 to 60 cars and trucks with Trump flags, slowly circling the block and slowly cruising the street.
This activity was extremely intimidating. They wanted to know why voters were not protected at this downtown drop box. When we asked Sedgwick County, the deputy election commissioner said current electioneering guidance does not cover drop boxes. Electioneering refers to things like wearing shirts or hats with a candidate's name on them, or waving campaign flags, all within 250 feet of a polling site.
There's no reference to ballot drop boxes in any statute, which means they're kind of a unique creature.
But attorneys with the Secretary of State's office add that doesn't mean voter intimidation hasn't happened, and that would still be illegal even at the drop boxes.
Statutes such as voter intimidation and advanced voter suppression would apply to any action along the entire process of receiving a ballot or turning it back in.
So was this weekend's rally voter intimidation?
What causes one person to be intimidated doesn't cause another person to be intimidated. So it's kind of difficult to put that in statute.
So if somebody feels like they've been intimidated, what should they do?
They can either approach the county elections officer and report what's going on, or they could call law enforcement, since these are criminal statutes.
And drop-off boxes, not something people were exactly thinking about before the end of this last legislative session.
Everything is so different this year, and this is just another example. You know, when we talk about election intimidation, what we've normally thought for the last, many, many decades is someone on election day, standing outside of a polling place and harassing people. But because people are voting by mail, they're voting in advance, they're voting in all these different locations, there are the drop boxes, that's just all, it's just spread out sort of what can happen around those sort of spots. But the idea of, what is intimidation, that's a great point. Freedom of expression, people have a right to stand on public property and wave their flag, whatever they want to do. Yep. But yeah, when people are casting incredibly important ballots in that box, I think we need to be careful.
Yeah, and voter intimidation, it sounds like a really bad phrase, like it's something horrible has happened, but it really is in the mind of the beholder. Michael.
Well, that's right. There's been a lot of publicity about relatively few incidents. In past seasons, it was often directed at Democrats. There was a splinter group called the New Black Panthers that had very few adherents, but they showed up at a couple of polling places in Pennsylvania and things like that. Now we're hearing about it more with Republicans. I think that this is one of those things that's not all that common, but it gets amplified in the news media. The other thing I want to say is that there's just something about Trump. I mean, I don't know that they had car rallies for Mitt Romney or John McCain, but I bet if they had, no one would have seen that as voter intimidation. But because of the way Trump acts and the things he says and tweets, just saying the name Trump provokes an entirely different emotional response than mentioning other politicians.
Yes, and I did get some pushback on that story. I had several folks who were at the rally come back and say, we didn't intimidate anybody. And of course the story never said they did, it said somebody felt intimidated. There's a difference. All right. Well, Michael, Suzanne, thank you both so much for joining us, but we are out of time again. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'd also like to thank our news partners at the Wichita Eagle, Cake News, and KSN News for sharing their materials with us. We'd love to continue with the discussions with you on social media. Just look for Pilar Pedraza TV or KPTS Channel 8 on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For now, stay safe and have a great week.
Southwest National Bank has proudly served Wichita and its surrounding communities for over 100 years. We are happy to support KPTS, Public Television for Kansas.